All right. I'm gonna give you a minute to sit down while I'm talking about myself. That's probably the least important thing. My name is David Lee. I'm the chair of this panel. As Charles has mentioned, I've been to New Orleans many times, some when I was teaching at Harvard and also when I came down to work on the Lambert Plan. I'm an architect and an urban designer. I have practice in Boston and am often here in New Orleans and part of the CSCD board. I have an august series of presenters here, and I'll let each of them introduce themselves. However, I want to try and set the theme here for a minute. Happy? Happy? We got a meeting going on here, man. Okay, thanks a lot. Listen, I want to start with an observation. If you can't dream it, it can't happen. And I want to add a quote to that. If the dream is big enough, sometimes the facts don't matter. Now, I am unapologetically a designer. And over the years, when I taught at Harvard and MIT and a little bit at RISD, I used to always say to my students, your job is to see the glass as half full. If you are a designer, your job is to see the glass as half full. You need to see opportunity where others only see despair. I also was invited one night to speak to a group of social scientists who were starting an organization back, and it was their annual meeting. And I had just been on a jury down at Yale. And in that jury at Yale, some people said to me, they said, you know, not just to me, but to the architects who were on this thing. There were some community people involved. And they said, you know what? You architects need to learn how to see socially, okay? You need to understand to see how to see the social environment you're working with. So I turned that on its head when I went back to talk to these assembled social scientists and social agency people and all of that. And I said to them, you need to learn how to see spatially because there is a connection between both of those things. Now, on that theme, I want to turn over the theme of this conference a little bit too, from disrupted sites to disrupted professional silos. I think it's very symbolic that the Jazz and Heritage Foundation is co-sponsoring this with the sustainability people because we need new models and we're going to have to let go of some old stuff. It can't just be reactive. We got to get proactive. A lot of stuff went down. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right, but it's also done. Sometimes there's such things as settled law, like the Affordable Health Care Act. Yeah, you're right. But we need to see some new coalitions and some new possibilities. Think back to the election just the other day. My granddaughter voted for the first time. She's had a black president since she was 14. She's gone to school with Asians, Latinos, white people. She has friends who are gay. She has friends whose parents are gay. They're not hung up with all this stuff we're hung up with. And that's the future. A lot of people missed that message the other day. And all of us, we got to let go some stuff if we're going to make it happen. And we got to do it in terms of how we think about things as well. I shared office space with a famous planner when I first started teaching, a guy named Kevin Lynch that some of you may know about. Kevin used to always say, whatever size the problem is, show me the next size up to begin to think about how to solve that problem. Now, Earthia made reference to this whole sustainability thing. The most sustainable thing you can do is preserve what you already have, because that does not involve new energy with tearing stuff down and moving it, driving it across the country and all of that. We have to look at what we have. And as people of color, we also have to embrace and enhance the communities we have. 25 years ago, I used to give talks, and I used to say to people, I said, you know what? One of these days, gas is going to be $2 a gallon, and people are going to want to start living back in the cities. So the other thing, I mean, there's just a lot of things on the table, but the other thing that's come up that we really got to think about, too, is the relationship between the public and the private sector, and I'm sure some of our speakers will talk about that. What's the responsibility in the public realm and what's the responsibility of private? You can't privatize everything. You can't privatize the Mississippi River. When stuff starts happening, we have to all work at it together. So I'm also not accepting this notion that it is our role to come plan for people who don't know how to help themselves. People know how to help themselves. We need to find out how to communicate that. We need to learn how to listen strategically, as Glenn said earlier. And we have to plan aspirationally. We have to have big ideas, big visions, and be willing to work for them. So I'm going to turn it over to the panel by saying this. Just remember the African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. Who's first?
I don't think I'm quite ready on the computer yet.
All right.
I'll go.
Lonnie's going to go. Introduce yourself.
Okay. My name is Lonnie Wilkinson. I serve as the Dean of the School of Architecture at Southern University in Baton Rouge, the only HBCU institution in the state of Louisiana with an architecture program. And it's a very interesting position to be in because it allows us to identify a lot of issues that are related to HBCU type institutions and the clientele that they serve. One of the things that I'd like to address regarding the nature of this symposium is that as we talk about identifying and assisting distressed communities, I think one of the things that I've heard circulating around the room that I think I need to emphasize, and David mentioned briefly, and that is we need to learn to listen. We need to learn to listen strategically and carefully at the people in the communities where we seek to assist. Many times, the residents of these communities, they know what their needs are. They need someone to help them articulate those needs and put them in a format that will allow them to be able to present them to those agencies and the other individuals that can assist them to get those things done. At the School of Architecture, our efforts in assisting communities goes through what we call the Urban Plus Rural Community Design Research Center. And initially, the center was an urban design research center. But when we started to listen to what the state of Louisiana says to us when we looked at its geography and its demographics, it became aware to us that there are more than just urban communities that need assistance. There are rural communities across the state that we can provide resource help to. And those communities are typically communities with populations and governments and leadership that are African American. And so we found it very interesting and desirous of us to reach out to those communities, because many of these communities have populations of 1,200, 1,500 people, but they need help to try to pull themselves up and out of the situations that they are in. So we address both urban communities. The most significant urban community that we've addressed, and there are two, but I'm going to give them to you in opposite order in which they happen, is the community in which Southern University in Baton Rouge lives. That community is called the Scotlandville community. it has been a distressed community as well as a disturbed community, an economically depressed community, socially depressed community for as long as I can remember. And I've been in Baton Rouge since 1966 as a student in architecture at Southern. And so when we decided to embark on trying to assist the community, the one thing that we said we were going to do is to make sure that whatever we engage in the community, that it would not be simply an academic exercise, that it has to be an exercise that at the end of the process, that the document that is presented, that goes on the shelf, we don't look at it in 3 or 5 or 10 years and say, look at what we've done. Our measure of success is 3, 5 years down the road to walk in that community and talk to the businesses and the residents of the community and say, these are the things that we assisted this community to do. Now, back to the notion of listening. We said that when we go into these communities, we're not going in to tell them what to do. We're going to ask them to tell us what they think they need and to tell us what their issues are. And we would provide the resources and the information to help them put those things in place so that they can then seek funding and assistance from government agencies as well as private developers to come in and help develop businesses and develop residential communities. And so that has been, we finished that process. And you can see it on, if you have your laptops or your iPads, you can go to urcdrc.org, and that's the website for the Urban Plus Rural Community Design Research Center. That's urcdrc.org. And the entire Scotlandville plan is laid out on that website. And so we think it was successful. We're now in the implementation phase where we're assisting with those developers who come in to acquire properties and then to proceed with developing those properties. We felt that individuals living in the communities had to have the voice, and we were the mechanism for them developing and speaking that voice to the greater Baton Rouge community. As a result of our efforts, the Scotlandville community was the only community plan that was included in the future BR plan, which is the master plan for East Baton Rouge Parish and the city of Baton Rouge, because of our efforts. And the planner that's on our faculty worked in conjunction, was the lead person in the design center that worked with Friganesi and Associates, planners out of Portland, Oregon, who was the planners that were selected for the Baton Rouge plan. And this was a cooperative effort that between Friganesi and Associates and the School of Architecture. And it was recognized by the Metro Council for the city parish that the School of Architecture was successful in assisting this community to the extent that the Metro Council adopted the Scotlandville SCCDP into the Baton Rouge master plan. The other outreach that we've done was here in New Orleans, and this happened right after Katrina, starting the December after Katrina. And we had a class of our students that came down and worked with the Pontilly community, which is made up of the Pontchartrain Park and the Gentilly Woods neighborhoods. So we came down and worked with them, and we assisted, we were invited down by some of the local community organizers as well as some of the local council people. And working along with that group was a local architecture firm of Hewitt and Washington that was beneficial in that, and we assisted them as well as they assisted us in working with the community. And again, this was an effort of listening and hearing what the people wanted and then putting into action and putting ideas in a format. And again, we went through several months of charrettes, with community organizations meeting. They had a facilitator that they brought in from another state that kept the charrettes going smoothly. And so it was a meaningful venture for us. And we believe that it was meaningful for the Pontilly neighborhood as well. So in our efforts, what we've found, and I'm going to wrap this up, what we've found that the communities that we have attempted to work with are distressed in primarily 4 ways. And they become distressed as a result of national disasters. They become distressed because of man-made disasters, where old technology has come and gone, and the results of the old technology that leaves contamination that has to be dealt with, that makes for a distressed community. The third one is man-made communities compounded by natural disasters. And then neglect over time is another contributor to distressed communities. And I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Dan, I want you to go next because we'll have to keep the 2 school things together.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, David.
Somebody left a wallet up here. Is that for me?
There's not much in there. You can have it. Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Dan Etheridge. I'm the Associate Director of the Tulane City Centre. We're the... this one. Yeah. Great, thanks. Can I just look at it straight up for that? How do I get onto...
While Dan's getting ready, who out there is my timer to let me know when they're getting to their 8 minutes?
Yeah.
You? Okay.
Thank you. So we are formerly the Applied Research and Outreach Centre at the Architecture School. That's the sort of university speak. That's what we tell the university leaders, to not pay too much close attention to what we're really doing, which is really trying to run a community design centre out of a university. And I feel like we fit very much with what Lonnie was just talking about in what I think is kind of it's a rapidly growing field in architectural education right now, and I think it's starting to make a generational shift into practice, where there is a real drive that's coming from the students, from our young folks, who are not satisfied with the traditional status quo of what a design career might look like. In fact, this is probably best underscored by a couple of recent exhibitions at the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, designed for the other 98%, I think was the name of it, or 90%, which showcased a lot of the work going on around the country in this sort of community design movement. In fact, I think the term people are falling behind now is public interest design. And so that's sort of what I would put the work of the Tulane City Centre in, this sort of national framework. We started soon after Hurricane Katrina. The idea existed beforehand, and obviously we had a very different framework in which to launch our centre. And we kind of took some time, a little bit of time to stop and think, because there were so many. We went from just before the storm, where we couldn't get architects and planners interested in going down and collaborating with communities, to a point where there were literally thousands of architects and designers all over all over the city. And so we tried to stop and think, we live here, we're going to be here for the long term, this energy and these resources are going to run out, so how is our role different? So at the city centre, we didn't participate as much as we would have liked to in some of the larger planning processes that have already been referenced. We actually spent our sort of limited resources and time trying to make direct partnerships with community groups on the ground and actually help them execute projects that had grown out of their community that might be quite small in the context of the work that needed to be done, but could be taken from idea through to ribbon cutting through to getting used. So I'm going to share a couple of very modest scale projects we did, and that was part of a broader strategy that, 7 years later we're still here, and we've got this body of work which I think better than the body of work is a body of relationships and a reputation in town for actually coming in and providing technical assistance so that neighbourhoods and community groups can make the future that they want in their neighbourhoods. I'll go through some basic objectives of what we do, and this kind of frames our work. So we provide a space or a forum for students and faculty to work on projects in partnership with community-based organisations. And I'll clarify that with the exception of one project we've been the co-developer on, every project we've ever done has been a community group has come to us wanting specific design and planning assistance for a project they have already defined. So that's our standard model. To promote the role of design and sustainability in the early stages of community-based development initiatives, I really enjoyed the talk earlier from Dr. Nance of clarifying green design doesn't go far enough and just design is a much more comprehensive term. This is what I was talking about, the generational shift, to expose students to design and development environments not typically associated with private practice. This is where we're trying to participate in changing the whole profession, really changing the model so that there are a lot more opportunities for people with these kinds of skills and training to work more broadly across the community. To build and maintain an asset for our architecture school to attract and retain high quality students and faculty. Actually, I learned an interesting thing about our graduate program recently. Our graduate program has tripled in size in the last 5 years, and every single incoming graduate student this year chose to come to this city to go to Tulane to participate in this work. And to provide a constructive and critical voice in the ongoing dialogues on the future of New Orleans. So I'm going to go into just a couple of projects. Some of these you might know of. The Holly Grove Growers Market and Farm in Holly Grove. We were approached by the Carrollton Holly Grove Community Development Corporation and the Neighbourhood Association in Holly Grove, who were... Holly Grove, sorry, I'm Australian, so I say a lot of words that sound a little bit different. And so there was an interest, this was a long-term nursery, there'd been a plant nursery. The owner did not want to reopen the nursery. There was concern because it was a particularly large piece of land and it was fairly derelict. And there had been some planning pre-hurricane about food access and food justice in this neighbourhood, particularly with an ageing population and nowhere you could walk to get access to fresh fruit and vegetables. So the neighbourhood association had actually already approached the owner of the land, who was interested in basically allowing access to this site for that use. And so we put together a team of faculty and students to work in partnership with this group of residents, and we developed a site master plan. This is often typically how we work. We'll come in and we do a visioning phase where we sort of work with our community partners. In fact, Janet here, I'm going to talk a little bit later about a project where we've just completed a visioning phase for her project. Sorry?
Not a lot later. You got 8 minutes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so moving right along. So where we sort of do the master planning and try to get people excited about a project, because this is partly about technical aspects of how can the project roll out, but it's about attracting resources to a project that doesn't yet have resources identified. And so these images are taken from this booklet that we put together that was actually successful in attracting some funding. We, of course, wanted funding to lay all the infrastructure and do some of the expensive stuff first, but no one would pay for that. We instead, very gratefully, got funding from Aveeno Beauty Products, who said, do something beautiful. We're a beauty products place. And that wouldn't allow us to get the building open and up to code, so we were asked to actually build a small pavilion at the entrance so that the site could get mobilised, they could start having their market, they could start growing the food that was getting, they could start selling the food that was getting grown there and brought in from farms locally in the area. So our students worked with this group of neighbours to help design this, and then for credit for in their curriculum, they built this pavilion, which I'm not an architect, and it's taken me a while to understand this strange group of people I work with. But I don't know why they never put people in these images. Beautiful photos. So I come along and add these ones later to show how these, to show some of the use of this kind of facility. So Holly Grove Growers Market and Farm continues to operate. And yeah, that's an example of one of the projects. We've actually been in partnership with them for a little over 4 years. Our work with them goes up and down as they need it. We really try to stay with the group. This is a small project called, it's an addition to a shelter for homeless women with children. I'm not going to say too much about it because I don't like us telling people where it is for obvious reasons, but we were asked to develop a playroom, turn just a deck into a playroom for the kids / yoga room, hangout room for the mums. So our students work with the residents of this facility over a 6-month period to put this addition onto the back of that facility. And so I don't have any images. I didn't know Janet was going to be here, but Janet is the founder and director of a phenomenal dance program, the New Orleans Dance Collective. And Janet was actually the recipient of one of our design and planning grants, which is the other thing I wanted to talk about today. We have had so much, we've been overwhelmed by different community groups saying, we need your services to do X, Y, or Z. And we had no real clear way of deciding how we were going to do those. We didn't feel comfortable with us sitting up there going, we'll do that one and that one and that one. And we didn't know how to make sure everyone had fair access to these services even being available. So we were able to get some funding that each year we do an announcement, a call to all non-profits or community-based organisations who can at least get a letter of support from a non-profit. We don't work for-profit entities. That's really the only thing. And it's for anyone with a sort of development project in mind can access our services for free. And then we put together a board that includes local architects and people from the school.
You got 1 minute, Dan.
Thank you. And community partners who we've worked with in the past to go through the applications and decide which projects we're going to do in the following year. And that way we try to make sure that the expertise across the board is deciding where our intellectual resources in the Tulane City Centre are getting spent. So I had a whole lot of other stuff, but obviously I talk too slowly and say things too strangely. But I hope that gives you a sense of the work that we do. And I've really enjoyed hearing about this term just design earlier. In fact, I was just at a conference where it's a group called SEED. Have you heard of the SEED net? Yeah. And it's essentially it takes the LEED. Many of you know about LEED, which is about making sure a green building is really green. SEED is like making sure people who are claiming to be working in partnership with communities are actually doing so, and establishing a level of excellence around this idea of just design. And that's a movement that I think we're all part of here, and we're all looking forward to taking to the next level. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I just want to make sure we got room for a few questions at the end. So, Jacques?
Yeah. Good afternoon. I'm going to abridge my remarks so we have time for discussion. My name is Jacques Morial. I'm a community organizer, public policy advocate, and a community servant. I wanted to share my understanding with you, and I think the work of Dean Wilkinson and Professor Lee and Dan really address some of the deep and visceral experiences we've had here in New Orleans and the lessons that we've learned. And while I don't consider any injustice to be settled law, Professor Lee, I think that by recounting and examining some of the injustices that disrupted this community, we can continue to learn some lessons. And it was a litany of injustices that violated all of the standards and values that the three of you all just discussed. It started with the Bring New Orleans Back Commission Green Dot that decided what neighborhoods and what people could return without their input. And then there was the destruction of public education and the dismissal of 6,000 public school employees, even though they had a collective bargaining agreement. That was a gross injustice, and the courts actually have recently decided that it was, and the local school district and unfortunately the local taxpayers are likely to be facing a judgment of more than $500 million for this injustice that we'll continue to suffer for financially. We had the injustices around public health and the refusal to reopen Charity Hospital, and half-baked plans for an academic medical center, a teaching hospital, that many of us warned from the very beginning was a fiscal house of cards, and we take no satisfaction in recognizing that today we can say we told you so. And these injustices continued with the Road Home program, which was totally ineffective for homeowners, but even worse, left out renters and small landlords, and essentially sent the message to working poor people that they weren't welcome to return. And of course, there was a destruction of public housing. When this city was suffering the greatest housing shortage of any American city in the history of this country, our policymakers and leaders decided that they were going to demolish more than 4,000 units of housing, 4,000 homes, half of them not severely damaged at all. And the rationale was that they were going to create safer communities, that these buildings themselves were somehow factories of crime. Well, crime actually is higher. The rate of violent crime is actually higher now than it was before Katrina. So that rationale actually had no basis. And it even extended to the faith communities. And I know some of my fellow parishioners from St. Augustine Parish are here. The Archdiocese of New Orleans decided that they wanted to close some parishes, not because they weren't viable spiritual communities, but for reasons of politics and money. The Archdiocese of New Orleans wanted to send FEMA money that the parishes in the downtown neighborhoods, Corpus Christi, St. Raymond, and Epiphany, were entitled to. They wanted to send this money over to the North Shore. And a lot of these injustices were addressed from the grassroots by good and honorable people who had no power and no money, and in many cases weren't even here or had no decent place to live. But our psyche and our spirit was disrupted by these injustices. And one thing that we can take away from this is that stakeholder rights and the voices of stakeholders have to be considered sacred in any planning or disaster response or policy making. policy making and planning must be inclusive and respectful of all stakeholders. It has to recognize all stakeholders. Public officials, elected officials, and bureaucrats can't decide who the stakeholders are. They can't pick and choose. In some cases, we suffered these injustices because they chose stakeholders who would agree with them and excluded stakeholders, legitimate stakeholders, who might disagree with them. Good and just policymaking and planning must also include creating and fostering a nurturing forum so stakeholders can reach a genuine consensus. And an effective forum is one that people have access to. One recent development that annoyed me a great deal, the Claiborne Corridor team did an initial sort of baseline study, and they did an online survey. And the impacted neighborhoods of broadband penetration in the impacted neighborhoods is less than 30%. All of this kind of reminds me of a proverb that emerged after Katrina, and it actually was coined by the good people from the People's Hurricane Relief Fund. And it kind of sums up some of these values that I hope policymakers and planners take to heart. And I know most of you in this room embrace these values, but I'm hoping to share with you some visceral experience and some of these injustices and how they have really wounded the spiritual identity of this city, so you can share your message and share that gospel more effectively. But the proverb that emerged after Katrina was, "Nothing about us is for us without us." I'm going to repeat that so everybody can maybe remember it. Nothing about us is for us without us. And we suffered all of these post-Katrina injustices. They claimed that demolishing public housing was going to make us safer, but nobody asked the residents of public housing what they thought. They said that firing all of the experienced and veteran school teachers and disintegrating the intellectual capital of public education that had been assembled over generations. They said that that would improve public education outcomes. We're still in the midst of an experiment on charter schools, but I do know that within the last 4 years, more than a dozen charter schools just in Orleans Parish have failed. On public health, they said that demolishing, not reopening Charity Hospital was the best because they were going to build a world-class academic medical center that would be the economic salvation of this city. Well, we heard that economic salvation story a few times in my lifetime. They said the same thing about the land-based casino, that it was going to be the economic salvation of the city. 20,000 jobs. It's going to lift the wage rate. Well, we know that that casino went bankrupt 2 or 3 times within the first 5 years, and fewer than 2,000 people work there today. We heard the same argument before the 1984 World's Fair, and we briefly discussed that at breakfast. The 84 World's Fair was supposed to restore New Orleans as the gateway to the Americas. Well, it was bankrupt too in about 4 months.
Okay, Jack, we have to wrap up.
So I'll just wrap up and say that the Academic Medical Center, which here we are more than 7 years after Katrina, the Academic Medical Center is facing severe fiscal problems, not the least reason being that the governor is rejecting Medicaid expansion of the Affordable Care Act. But my point in all of this is to remember that put the stakeholders first and give them the tools that they need to act effectively in their own self-interest. And that is our obligation as policymakers, planners, and community advocates.
Very good. I appreciate, and all of us in the room should appreciate Jacques' description of himself as a community servant. Some of us forget that our professional training ultimately is about service. I want to ask a question, though, that will cross all three boundaries. And I take to heart your critique about my comment about settled law. And I want to parse that a little bit, because I, to some extent, am talking about stuff that happened 30, 40 years ago, and folks are still fighting the same fights, many of which have gone beyond them, and the world has changed considerably. When I say that, though, I don't mean that we shouldn't look back and try and change some things. But in an era of limited resources, I think we have to be strategic about how we do that, and how much time we spend redressing, old grievances when people are facing real problems right in front of them is a tough dilemma. Lonnie brought up the notion of the activist university involved in all of this and how the university can help. And Dan talked about specific projects. Now, when you got architects who are way, way underemployed these days, the idea of school versus the profession becomes an issue. How we can best work together and use all of our resources becomes an issue. And if we really bear the ugly truth, architects are very involved in this sort of starchitect notion, and it's more about them than it is about the people they're supposed to be serving. So how do we mitigate between, students wanting to do stuff that they think will end up in the magazines, as opposed to really listening and building what the people of the community identify with? Anybody want to take on any of those themes?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. I think that there needs to be partnerships.
Pull a little closer.
For this whole thing to work effectively, I think there needs to be partnerships developed between the academic community and the professional community, such that, one, students, as they go through this 5, 6, 7, 8-year academic process, they get a handle on what is really expected of them as they move into the profession. And at the same time, the practitioners can not only share their knowledge with the students in a real way, so that the students are getting firsthand, real practical information, and at the same time, as the university community moves in and begin to work with community groups, community organizations, the projects that are developed as a result can then be brought to the professional community, so that those projects can become reality for the community groups that have presented these projects. And so I think that as we go through this, if we keep the level 1 stakeholders, meaning the residents, the people that live at the heart of the issue, if we keep them first and foremost in whatever we do on the community level, then I think that we can then have partnerships that branch academia, community, local government, local political individuals, the practicing professionals, the construction community, the whole range of professional areas that are involved with architecture and construction.
Dan, what are some of the obstacles you've engaged in come up against trying to do this?
Well, I was actually going to build first on just what
Okay.
Lonnie was saying there is, when we first started doing this work at Tulane, it was very much a case of a lot of our students thought it was fun to do some of these projects. They thought it was important. And then when school was over, they were resigned to a more traditional model of practice. Now we are getting students say, we need you to teach us how we can keep doing this as a profession. They're essentially asking us to help them change the profession with them. And I think what Lonnie just outlined, much more cross-sector, is the way to do that. And there's a lot of work to be done there. The other, you brought up the point in possible conflict between private practice and academia. And that's something we've had to be very careful about. It's sometimes, mostly we've found a very supportive professional community here. It's occasion we've had people question whether we're taking work away from them, and I have to I have to not say what I first want to say because when we're not taking money from anyone
You're in a room
to do
where
any
you
work.
can say what you first wanted to say.
Well, I wanted to say we would love you to be more interested in doing these kinds of projects, and frankly, we've got more than we know what to do with, so get on board. But we are trying to build a more articulate case that the profession is changing, that we are training people who can help private practice reinvent itself to be more relevant, and for the communities in this city and everywhere else to actually get access to the skills that they have that can help people make their own futures.
Okay. Finally, Jack, just one thing, and then I'll ask questions of anybody. I know I'm running out of time here. Are the universities stepping up, in your opinion, whether it's design or law or business or whatever else?
Well, I think they certainly are, but we had a wave of academic institutions that, I don't want to use the word exploited us as a laboratory, but
It's okay in this room.
I think it might be a little bit too strong of a
Okay.
word, but they used us as a laboratory in the months and year or two right after Katrina. And they've moved on, and I'm not saying that they didn't provide value to us, but the academic institutions and the academicians and professors who have remained engaged, have really built capacity among stakeholders. They have allowed people to develop the tools that they need to act in their own self-interest. The Ninth Ward is a great example. When I first met Austin Allen, and he brought his students to the lower Ninth Ward, I didn't know a lot about Austin's background, but it became clear to me after watching his students go door to door in the lower Ninth Ward to listen to stakeholders that, Austin was a kindred spirit. He had been a community organizer, and he brought those skills and values to his work and inspired them in his students.
And, in a way, you may have brought this to a logical closure here in a sense, because I thought it was important in what you said, and it may be the answer to the quote about nothing about us without us, and that is capacity building. And if, in fact, we leave ladders in place for the community to develop the capacity to build for itself, then maybe all of our efforts have been worth something. Questions from out there really quickly? Yes.
It's not really a question in a sense, but a statement and then maybe a question after. The statement is,
I hope that one works. It hadn't been working up till now.
I think I need to turn it
Okay,
this
it's
way.
good. It's good.
The statement goes back to your statement, Professor Mario. Part of that statement, the academy has a dual responsibility. Number one, it has to educate those students. If they are architectural students in either the landscape or building architecture capacities, I think you did get a good deal because they were able to dream. And their dreams allow the practitioners to dream a little further. Instead of the box with the 4 vertical walls and the flat roof, they gave it a round roof with slant walls. Well, the practitioner, because they are operating inside of the environment where the dollars and cents really define the 90-degree walls and the flat roof, they may not have a chance to dream too much. But the students can dream. Number two, in response to whether or not the practice environment takes anything from the academic environment takes anything from the practice environment, it really does not. It has a limitation. Number one, for the building architects, when those projects are pushed in the environment of the imagination and they go to a certain point, the student has to be trained to go 10, 15, 20 years beyond. Usually the more appropriate situation is for that project to be carried to the design development level and handed off to the practice operation, and that is what Mr. Wilkinson is advocating. If there are partnerships between the practice environments and the academy, then those projects, the center, your center, or the Urban Plus Rural Community Design Research Center will hand those projects off to the partnering practice office.
Okay.
Thank you.
All righty. I'll give one final, you know, Matilda, do you want to say something, sweetheart, since you had trouble with your machines and everything? I don't want to put you on the spot. Never mind. I'm just kidding you. All right. A question over there, and then Lonnie, I'll let you go last. Okay. Real quick. I'm in trouble. I'm over my line here.
Mr. Morial.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned tools for the stakeholders. The affluent stakeholders have finances, banking relationships, political allies. What do you envision as the tools for those stakeholders without those opportunities and assets? And how do you see tools being developed among universities, nonprofits, to provide tools necessary to be represented in the way they should?
Well, most of the most important and powerful tools are understanding and relationships, understanding fellow stakeholders and what their interests are and what they're good at, and the relationships of trust among stakeholders, understanding that we're not going to agree all of the time, but there's great value in consensus and mutually respectful compromise. And the way you develop these tools is by working together on a particular challenge or problem. You know, you can't really develop these tools and this sort of intellectual capital in the abstract. You learn by working with your neighbors, and you learn by working with government officials, bureaucrats, planners. So the most powerful tools, of course, money is important. And it would be great if your neighborhood association had a big pile of money and could go hire their own architects, their own planners, and their own lawyers. But
Be good for architects, too.
Yeah, very, very rarely the case. But most of the tools are soft in nature, meaning that they're not tangible. It's not like a hammer, but it's an understanding of, you know, how a hammer and a saw work together. And I just want to make one comment on the intersection between academic and practice. You know, the academic side is really an ongoing investment in the practice side. It's, you know, it inures ultimately to the benefit of the practice side because it challenges the practice side. It moves it forward. It propels it forward with new thought, new creativity. It's more provocative than the practice side could be within the financial and economic constraints. So they're both very important. And you know, the pendulum is never going to remain still. There's always going to be some tension, and there's value in that tension.
Absolutely. Okay, Lonnie, if it's real quick, and then that's the end, I promise.
David, I'll help with this because this is really not a question, but it's a thought. I've heard in my limited time being here this morning that some folks have said out of disaster come opportunities. And what immediately goes to my mind fast forwarding is the economic development, you know, that comes out of this disaster. All the billions of dollars that is going to be spent in areas where disaster, not in New Orleans, but, you know, the next, I guess, is going to be New York City and that whole area up there. So the thought is whether or not that economic opportunity is benefiting the community in which those disasters occur. If you're going to build capacity, you have to take that disaster and turn that into an opportunity that helps to build that community and stand that community up. And the question is, are we doing that?
Well, I'll that's a long question, but I'll end it with an observation that Bill Maher made the other night on his show when they talked about how, you know, the Lord is supposed to be able to intervene if a woman has been raped to keep the pregnancy from happening. And Bill Maher asked, well, shouldn't the Lord intervene before the rape?
All right, well, thanks to this wonderful panel, to all the great panels that we've had this morning. We are going to roll right into our next panel. They're setting up the luncheon, so please be patient and bear with the staff here at Basin Street Station as they make that happen. In the meantime, I'd like to invite Vaughn Fourier and the others on the luncheon panel to come to the podium, and we will begin right away and keep things rolling. So they are going to be setting up lunch in just a minute, so please feel free to help yourselves during the panel discussion. And thank you all for being here.
Take a bathroom break, please. You got 5 minutes.